Nottingham is a city long associated with calm and quiet living, a place where people believe the narrow streets will remain safe once night falls. But on the evening of November 10th, 2021, in just a few seconds of silence, everything changed. There was no gunshot, no screaming, only the blue and red lights reflecting in nearby windows, and a man lying motionless on the cold pavement. That moment did not just take a life. It marked the arrival of an underground world that no one in this neighborhood ever wanted to see. On the evening of November 10th, 2021, that sense of order was broken. Not by a loud explosion, not by chaos like something out of a movie, but by a very brief moment of silence. So brief that if you were not there, you might not even notice it. Yet for those who lived in the meadows, that moment felt endless. It was the moment when the sound of an ambulance siren echoed through a street, usually familiar only with footsteps and the wind. When blue and red lights reflected in the windows of homes where a mother was preparing dinner, a child was doing homework, and a family believed this would be an evening like any other. Nottingham had once been that peaceful, and it was that very peace that made the shock cut deeper. A man lay motionless on the cold pavement. No one screamed. No one fully understood what had just happened. There was only a deeply human feeling that something had been lost, that an invisible line had been crossed, that from this moment on, the neighborhood would never be the same again. People stood behind the police cordon, staring into the darkness where everything had just ended. No one said it out loud, but everyone understood. When violence appears in a place accustomed to calm, it does not only take a life, it leaves behind fear. It plants a quiet question in every heart. Was this just an isolated incident, or a sign of something much larger, silently existing right among them? Wilford Crescent West that evening looked no different from any other day. A narrow road, faded yellow streetlights, houses quiet after dinner. This was not a place people associated with violence, and not a place where someone expected to face the final moment of their life. Michael O'Connor walked slowly. He came here with a simple thought: to talk, to resolve things, and then to leave. He believed that conflicts could stop before crossing a line. That belief was deeply human, and because of that, it was fragile. There was no warning sign, no calling out, no argument, just a few figures separating themselves from the darkness. The distance between them and Michael vanished in an instant. Everything happened so fast that the mind could not process what was unfolding. A knife drove into his chest. No excess, no hesitation, precise, like a decision made long before that moment. Michael collapsed onto the cold pavement, his breathing broken, his eyes wide open, as if still searching for an explanation that would never come. The attackers disappeared as quickly as they had appeared. The street fell silent again, but it was no longer an ordinary silence. It was a heavy stillness, pressing down on every home nearby. A man lay there, in a neighborhood that only hours earlier had been filled with laughter and familiar sounds. No one screamed. No one rushed forward at once. Only shock and a creeping cold that spread not just from the motionless body, but from the fear beginning to settle in the hearts of those who witnessed it. When the ambulance arrived, it was already too late. On Wilford Crescent West, death did not arrive with noise. It came quietly, and it left behind a street that would forever be remembered not for its peace, but for the moment a life was taken in silence. The next morning, Wilford Crescent West woke up to a very different atmosphere. The street was still there. The houses stood unchanged. But the feeling was no longer the same. Residents stepped outside with guarded eyes. Familiar greetings became hesitant. Everyone knew that something serious had happened, even though no one had witnessed it in full. The news spread quickly, not through social media at first, but through whispered conversations, through windows, over garden fences, through anxious glances exchanged between neighbors. A man had been killed on this very street, in a place many families had once believed was completely safe. For the people of the meadows, the fear did not come from death alone. It came from the questions that followed. Why here? Why this street? And most importantly, could it happen again? Police presence increased. The cordon stretched further along the road. Patrol cars moved slowly through the neighborhood. But even that visible show of authority could not erase the unease. Because the way it happened felt too cold, too fast, too precise. People began to realize this was not a moment of rage, not a random fight between strangers. There were no signs of chaos, no prolonged shouting, just a brief moment and an ending that could not be undone. Within the community, grief mixed with confusion. People mourned a life lost, but at the same time, they feared for themselves. When violence can appear in the quietest place, it shatters the deepest belief people hold, that home is safe, that their neighborhood exists outside the dark stories. And from that feeling, a realization slowly took shape. This death did not stand alone. It was a sign of an underground world existing alongside everyday life, silent, patient, and far more dangerous than anyone had imagined. If you passed him on the street, you would likely forget his face within minutes. Yet it was precisely that anonymity that made him dangerous. In Nottingham's underworld, the name Mackenzie had existed long before the night on Wilford Crescent West, not through loud, headline-making incidents, but through steady presence, silent, persistent, like a shadow that was always there, even when no one could clearly see it. He understood one thing very well. Violence does not need to be displayed. It only needs to be sufficient to create fear. Mackenzie did not stand on street corners making deals. He did not exchange goods hand to hand. He stayed behind the scenes, watching, deciding, letting others do the dirty work for him. With those beneath him, Mackenzie never needed to raise his voice to be obeyed. He built a system where everyone knew their place. Who delivered? Who held the money? Who handled problems? And who would disappear if they made a mistake? People who once knew Mackenzie described him as calm, quiet, always in control of his emotions. But beneath that calm was a coldness that made others wary. He was the kind of man who did not need to prove his power, because his power spoke for itself. Money flowed steadily. The network expanded. Familiar city streets slowly became transport routes. And while life on the surface appeared normal, a criminal empire was growing quietly underneath. For Mackenzie, this was not a game. It was business. And in that business, there was no room for hesitation. When someone was seen as a threat, the question was never whether to act, only when. On the night Michael O'Connor fell, many people saw only the attackers moving through the darkness. But beneath that, there was someone who never appeared at the scene, someone standing behind it all. And from the shadows, Tmaine Mackenzie directed a chain of events that led to an ending that could never be undone. If Tmaine Mackenzie was the cold mind operating in the shadows, then Jezzel Dennis was the arm that carried those orders into the real world. Dennis was not the one who made the final decisions, but he was the one who turned decisions into action. And in this gang's world, action often came with violence. Jezzel Dennis understood his role clearly. He moved more, met more people, dealt directly with situations where words no longer worked, with those who owed money, with those who crossed boundaries, with anyone who threatened the smooth operation of the system. The gang did not survive through chaos. On the contrary, it was built as a tightly organized structure. There were drivers, lookouts, runners, money holders, and there were people like Dennis, responsible for the tasks no one wanted to talk about, but everyone knew were necessary. Violence in this world was not spontaneous. It was used as a tool, strong enough to intimidate, precise enough to avoid drawing attention too early. A look, a message, an action carried out at the right moment. All of it designed to send a clear signal that control was still firmly in their hands. Most of those drawn into the system were young. Some were pulled in by money, some by the sense of belonging to something bigger, some because they saw no other way out. And once inside, leaving became almost impossible. Jezzel Dennis was the one who kept the machine turning. He did not need fame. He did not need to be spoken about often. It was enough that people knew when Dennis appeared, things had reached a point of no return. And the way violence was organized and calculated revealed a chilling truth. These were not reckless individuals acting without order. This was a system, and within that system, violence was not an exception. It was part of how it functioned. On social media, their lives looked like a dream many young people long for. Photos by pools in sunny destinations, designer clothes, shiny watches on their wrists, expensive bottles open to loud music. Everything pointed to one thing: money and power. But social media only reflects what people choose to show. It does not tell the story behind it. It does not reveal the dark streets where goods change hands. It does not show the cramped rooms where fear is always present. And it certainly does not show the true price paid for that glamorous life. That contrast is exactly what draws so many people in. Looking at the surface, they see success, they see freedom, they see a shortcut out of a hard daily life, but they do not see the sleepless nights, the constant need to stay alert, the relationships built not on trust, but on suspicion. Behind every image is a different reality, a system that survives on silence and fear, money earned not through work, but through the destruction of its own community, through other people struggling with addiction, debt, and violence. Some of those smiling in front of the camera understood this very well. They knew that everything they had was fragile. One small mistake, one glance in the wrong direction, one word spoken at the wrong time. Any of it could cause that luxurious life to collapse in an instant. And that contrast is where the tragedy lies. When a glamorous surface hides a blood-stained truth, it does not only deceive outsiders, it also deceives those living inside it, convincing them that everything is fine, until the price to be paid becomes impossible to deny. That night had not yet come to an end. While many people in the meadows were still awake, trying to make sense of what had just happened, the violence had not stopped. It had simply taken another form. Faster, more reckless, and more dangerous. Just minutes after the killing, on another street not far from the scene, a man appeared on a security camera, walking quickly, eyes tense, a gun in his hand. No warning, no argument, just a single action meant to end everything in an instant. A finger pulled the trigger, but there was no sound. The gun jammed. That brief moment was enough to change everything. The man facing him escaped death by inches, and the gunman disappeared into the darkness, carrying a message that needed no words. This was no longer about hiding. This was a display of power, a cold reminder that anyone could become a target, that death was not meant for just one man who had already fallen. In the community, fear spread faster than any news report. People understood that the murder was not the end. It was only the beginning of a series of acts meant to assert control. Blood had been spilled, and that night, violence was used to say what no one dared to say out loud. For those behind it all, this was the final message. Silence was complicity, and resistance, even in thought alone, could be paid for with a life. After that night of violence, police understood they were facing something far greater than a single murder. This was no longer just the story of a knife in the dark. It was the trace of a network. And to reach it, they would need time, patience, and an approach as cold and calculated as the people they were pursuing. Operation Haversack was launched quietly. No sirens, no dramatic press conferences, just people sitting in offices lit through the night, staring at screens, connecting fragments of scattered data. Each short phone call, each signal that appeared and vanished, each vehicle briefly captured by traffic cameras. They followed what the killers believed to be invisible. Phones used once and discarded, short trips between cities, hotel rooms rented for only a few hours. Everything left a trace. And those traces carried no emotion. They spoke only the truth. Some investigators spent weeks tracking a single car, a single route, a pattern repeated again and again. Some knew the timelines so well they could close their eyes and still see the city map forming in their minds. This was not a chase of speed. It was a hunt of endurance. Piece by piece, the fragments began to fit together. People who seemed unrelated started appearing at the same times, in the same places. Meetings that looked random were revealed to be carefully arranged. And the death of Michael O'Connor no longer stood alone. It sat at the center of a chain of actions planned long in advance. With Operation Haversack, police were not only searching for the man who struck the blow, they were hunting the system behind it, a system that survived on darkness and silence. And when the light finally began to shine, it did not arrive loudly. It came slowly, but it was impossible to escape. When the pieces were finally in place, police knew the moment to act had arrived, not in haste, but with absolute calculation. Every move had to be precise, because a single mistake could allow those under surveillance to disappear forever. The raids happened almost simultaneously in multiple locations: Nottingham, Birmingham, Manchester. Before dawn had fully broken, doors were struck hard. There was nowhere left to hide, no time to erase evidence. Those who believed they were safe in the shadows were suddenly forced into the light. Some were jolted awake from sleep. Others were preparing to leave their homes. Shocked expressions, heavy silence. The confidence once shown in moments of boasting was gone. All that remained was the feeling of being cornered. Inside flats and safe houses, the truth began to surface. Single-use phones, clothing matching images captured on cameras, carefully hidden cash, drugs packaged and ready for distribution. Each seized item was more than evidence. It was an accusation that needed no argument. Some said nothing as the handcuffs were placed on them. Others tried to remain composed. But inside, the world they had built over years was collapsing layer by layer. Violence had once allowed them to control others. Now, it no longer worked. As the suspects were taken away, the neighborhood fell quiet again. But it was a different kind of quiet, no longer filled with hidden fear, no longer marked by the sense of being watched. The evidence had spoken. And this time, the darkness was no longer deep enough to hide what had been exposed. The trial began in a heavy atmosphere. There were no dim streetlights anymore, no shadows left to hide in. Everything unfolded under the cold white light of the courtroom, where every word was recorded and every glance examined. People who once stood on opposite sides of the world now sat only a few meters apart. The family of Michael O'Connor, and those accused of playing a part in taking his life. No one spoke, yet the tension was visible in every breath. The trial stretched on for months. Each day passed slowly. Prosecutors did not tell the story through emotion. They let the data speak. Movement maps, call timings, camera footage, details that seemed meaningless on their own now came together to form a complete picture that could not be denied. One by one, the links began to collapse. Denials grew weak when faced with evidence. Eyes avoided contact. Long moments of silence filled the room. The arrogance was gone. The careless attitude once displayed on social media had vanished. All that remained was the raw truth slowly emerging before everyone. For the victim's family, each day in court meant reliving the pain, hearing their loved one's name spoken in the context of death, listening again to every detail of the fatal night. Yet they kept coming, sitting there, silent, because justice, even when slow, had to be seen through to the end. As witnesses stepped down one after another, as the final arguments were delivered, there was no longer any doubt about what was happening. Those who once believed power would protect them now understood that no system can exist forever in the dark. And there, in front of everyone, piece by piece, that empire was collapsing beyond repair. The day of sentencing arrived in tense silence. The courtroom was packed. The air was so heavy that even a quiet cough could be heard clearly. Men who once walked the streets with a sense of invincibility now stood before the dock. No bodyguards, no followers, only themselves and the consequences of the choices they had made. As the sentences were read out, each number echoed slowly. Together they amounted to 85 years in prison, a figure that did not only represent time behind bars, but an entire lifetime of power fading away. Years once built on fear were now exchanged for 4 cold walls. Tremaine Mackenzie stood there, listening. His face showed little emotion. Yet in that moment, everything he had once controlled slipped from his grasp. No more orders, no more choices. Only a long stretch of time ahead, passing slowly, day after day, in silence. For Michael O'Connor's family, there was no complete sense of relief. No sentence could bring their loved one back. But at least they knew that those responsible had been named. Justice may arrive late, but it had arrived. As the defendants were led away, the courtroom slowly emptied. The power that once made an entire neighborhood afraid was now nothing more than a memory. And in that quiet, one truth became clear. No empire built on violence survives forever. It is only a matter of time.